the thing about Don that's really great is that what first hits you is obviously his Disney past, and it's significant, obviously.
And then his sheer size.
The size, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then, but we were gonna come dressed up as Pocahontas and Miko, but we were discouraged from doing so.
Thank God, yeah.
Yes, thank goodness.
I have a little chamois outfit in the hotel room, but I didn't fit anymore.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So what we're gonna do today actually is not just look at Don's kind of linear history, but really try and link it through with what we go through as artists. I'm assuming most of you, a lot of you are, and it's kind of finding your artistic path. The thing is too that fascinated me about you, Don, is your brain. That was the thing.
Thank you, Ted.
Yes, what a brain you have. But the incredible thing about it is like learning about you and hearing about you from so many people. It's your curiosity and intellect that you bring to a lot of different aspects of your life. And I just thought that we would, instead of kind of looking at them in a linear way, we would look at them in different categories. So
sure,
we came up with something called Don's brain. And this buzzer,
no,
yes, will allow you to stop on any given, we'll show you. We're going to go to this Don's brain.
Don has not seen this.
Yes. And then you could hit it any time, and then we'll see what happens.
This could be a new game show.
This is a great, yeah.
Yeah.
Here we go. So this belongs to you.
We'll pass this around later.
All right. All right, so here we go.
Yeah, that's my brain, all right.
And you could hit it at any time.
And oh, geez, yeah.
So
there's some categories in here I'm very afraid of, actually.
And so obviously, you know, you've written a score of books. Here we go. Before, Ever, After, which is my favorite because it contains all these notes from Disney and Don Hahn and all these great things drawn to life. Your books with Walt Stanchfield, who was one of your mentors, right?
Yeah, I mean, I love books. I really love books. I have too many of them at home, and I'm kind of a hoarder, so I have a lot of books at home. And I also felt like over my career, I've been able to run into so many interesting people that had so much to say, and so a lot of my books, almost all of them actually, are about that. They're either about people I've worked with, or in the case of Walt Stanchfield, who was one of my mentors, or the Before, Ever, After book, which is all of Don Graham's writings back in the 1930s and 40s when they were trying to figure out what animation would be. And I love publishing those things because they're like these little hidden gems that sit on a shelf in the Disney archives and don't go anywhere. And we all pass them around. Right? We were talking about this. You have, I have like 2/3 of the lectures
copies
and
of everything.
I have one of these and 2 of those. And so I thought, let's just put them all in one place so we can all share the information. And Disney was really supportive of that, thankfully. So that's what a lot of these books are, is just trying to pass on that information. And I'm not a great animator. I mean, I draw and paint, but I never was going to be Glenn Keane or somebody who was like an amazing animator. So to be able to share this stuff and pass it out and have people learn from it and have you guys be able to look at it is something that's really cool and I love doing.
Yeah, there's some others here. Brainstorm, and I think that was interesting to read because obviously each one of your books, like your films, it seems like it relates to something that you're feeling at the time.
Yeah, I don't know. I was probably drinking heavily during the writing of this book. No, I'm kidding. I was not. It's about. I don't know. I've always been interested in people that say, "Oh, I can't draw," or "I'm no," and I relate to that because we all are really insecure about what we do, and I am at the top of the list. I've done a lot of films and worked with a lot of good people, but I'm always a little insecure about what I'm doing, especially when you're starting out on a new project. You think, well, life was good 20 years ago, but today I don't know what I'm doing. And so this is a book a little bit about that, a little bit about your insecurities and about how to approach living a life as a creative person. Because there's not a lot of roadmaps for that. And this is not the only roadmap, but I've worked around a lot of really interesting creative people, from musicians like Hans Zimmer or Howard Ashman, to artists, to painters, and just people that I really admire. And it's a lot about that, a lot about how to be okay with being a creative person in a society that doesn't know what to do with that. So that's what this book's about.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's my favorite of yours, I think. For me and for people in the room who know me, I'm just obsessed with how the studio was run and how it started, and Walt's notes. And we were talking, everyone at CalArts has this incomplete set of his notes that got passed along, and they're copied 18,000 times, and you cherish it, and and to know that everything, it's complete. It
is.
Yeah, it must have been amazing to put this together.
Yeah, it's interesting because these are a series of lectures that were done in the 30s, and it's interesting because Walt had a little bit of money because Mickey Mouse was huge. Mickey Mouse was, it's hard to believe. I don't know, it's like Tickle Me Elmo or something, but he was like a huge, huge character, especially in Europe. And so Walt was a little bit of a folk hero and made millions during the Depression. And consumer products helped that too. So when he got a little bit of money, he put his artists to school because he was trying to make that transition out of the cartoon business into the feature business. And so he brought in a guy named Don Graham, who was not an animator and did not work in film, and he was an art instructor. And they looked at paintings by Matisse and Velázquez, and they looked at life drawings, and they brought in animals to draw, and they really put on a school at the studio. And in 1936, 37, they spent over $1 million a year just on training, which is amazing to me. And during that time, they transcribed and wrote and copied all the training exercises, but they sat on a shelf for a long time. So that's what this book is. It's all the training exercises of people talking about color theory and audience response to color and editing and sound.
Animation technique. And, from people that we all know their names, like Ward Kimball and Bill Teitla and that, but they actually wrote it down. So that's why I want to, again, capture it and put it in one place so that people didn't have to hunt for them on the black market anymore. Yeah, this has kept me up many a night, looking at these. And then, of course, your latest came out last week.
Yeah. This is... This is a trip down memory lane. Yesterday's tomorrow. There was a time in the 50s. I'm crazy about mid-century architecture, and I live in a house that looks like Mr. Incredible's house. So it has terrazzo floors, and it's really nice. A little superhero outfit in the closet. So I wanted to do a book about Disney's impact on mid-century art, architecture, filmmaking, that kind of thing. And that's what this book is. So it's huge. This is probably like actual size. It's a huge book. And it's full of, I went through the archives and the Animation Research Library and the Imagineering Library and pulled all this cool artwork that I've wanted to see for years and years and years, and put it in this book to try to rekindle whatever it was they had back in the 50s and 60s in Southern California. It was an era of optimism. People were coming back from World War II. The country had been in 2 world wars and a depression, and they were just coming out of that. And Disney was in this unique position to really capitalize on that. And so he was the first in television. He was the first in, planning cities of the future, the first in talking about space travel, the first in working with Eisenhower about interstate highway systems and that kind of thing. So it's a really fascinating time, and I tried to put it all inside this book.
Yeah, it's super, super beautiful. All right, let's pick up the buzzer and go for another category. Here we go.
Okay, wish me luck.
Oh boy.
I can do this one.
So the interesting thing about you, and we were talking, and he'd know this today, you've worked on 17 animated productions, but 8 features, and you've actually made more documentaries now than you produced features in animation, which is really incredible. Let's talk a little bit about some of your favorite films and the transition really to documentary filmmaking, because I think that's kind of who you are now, and that's where you want to go towards.
Yeah, it really is. I think it has to do with just where I am in my life right now. And I feel like I've worked a lot in animation and have loved it and don't regret a minute of it. And particularly love the people that work in animation. But personally, as a filmmaker, it is such a collaborative sport. I felt like I wanted to do something that was far more personal and involved a more intimate style of storytelling. And so I really gravitated towards documentaries. It's such a golden age of documentaries right now that we're going through, kind of a golden age of television as well. So the chance to tell a story with a small crew of maybe 5 or 6 people, small budgets, and do this treasure hunt, which documentary filmmaking is. It's you're digging deep in this tremendous kind of hunt for information. And it also has the feeling of whitewater rafting. This is me actually up in Transylvania, in the north part of Romania. I was shooting a documentary up there about the pediatric AIDS crisis in Romania, of all things. But it's just lit me up because it's something where I can go out and hold a camera and film something, and I can work on it in a very hand-on make. I found out about myself that I'm a real maker. I love to make things. I'm more of a craftsman than I am anything. And so the chance to make something with my hands in animation is one thing, but when you're a producer in animation, you're looking at things globally, you're trying to team build, you're encouraging people, and you're really a servant of the artists who are actually making the film. When you're a documentary filmmaker, you can control it and you have your hands on it. The only thing out of control is the story. I always say it's like putting a jigsaw puzzle together without knowing what the picture is on the box. So once you go through that process, you have this wonderful opportunity to put the pieces together and go where the story takes you. And most of these movies start out in one direction and then goes in a completely different direction because of some discovery you've made.
Yeah, it just seems like thematically the thing that carries you through is storytelling, because your documentaries are so diverse. They don't necessarily follow one track. And I remember you said once that storytelling is the currency of humanity. And do you feel that kind of runs through your films? Because from watching them, I think it kind of does a little bit.
Yeah, I've been really interested in storytelling lately because I feel like it's obviously unique to us as humans. It's how we pass along, behaviors and what it is to be a human. But it's also how we pass along hope or despair or how other human beings deal with life. And the opportunity to do that is in one part selfish, because I'm curious how to live life. I'm curious what these people did, particularly when it's artistic heroes. We did a documentary last year about Tyrus Wong, the Chinese-American art director who did Bambi. And you find out how he came to the United States through Angel Island and all the kind of problems he went through to get to a career in the arts. And it's encouraging and uplifting, and I love learning about that. So there's a selfish part of it, and then there's a great part of sharing it. I love to show people a film and have them kind of unwrap the box of, look, I made this thing for you. I hope you really like it, and here it is. Whether it's animated or a documentary, I love that feeling. And part of it is it probably strokes my ego to a certain extent, because it's fun to see people like Beauty and the Beast this year, to people go see that movie. It's this wonderful, humble feeling of accomplishment for all of us, because it's a real big movie. But I get the same feeling out of a documentary.
Now, to talk about, we briefly talked about it before, now that you've gone from the larger animated productions into more intimate documentaries, imagine going forward, what kind of film would you want to make, knowing that maybe only 5 people would go see it, but you would love it? What type of film would that be?
I don't think we can mention that on the stage here, actually.
It involves the Pocahontas costume?
Yeah, so Pocahontas and Miko are involved.
Yeah.
No, that's not true. I don't know. I'm kind of a curious person, so it might go in a number of directions. I still have a longing to do more animation. I love hand-drawn animation, but not in a bitter, disenfranchised way. There's a way to say, God damn it, these computers are terrible, and I don't feel that way at all. I love computer graphics and feel like it's a modern miracle. I love stop-motion animation, and I love hand-drawn animation because it's a graphic medium. It's really fundamentally different as a design exercise than it is to make rigs and characters move around on the screen. So I love the design challenge of a hand-drawn film. So I would love to do something like that. I'd love to do more musicals. And I probably would do more intimate films with fewer explosions. Something that's, things that are smaller about characters and emotions and relationships. And that's probably because of my advanced age, and I'm losing my testosterone. But I feel like those kinds of relational movies are really important, and something that animation is so good at. I mean, those of you here tonight that work in animation, we are so lucky to be able to work in that medium, and it's kind of a boom time for animation right now. And to be able to take nothing and turn that into human emotion is like sorcery. It's like alchemy to me, and I have done it all my life, and I will never get tired of it.
All right. You ready for the buzzer?
Always.
All right, here we go. Producer.
Oh, geez.
So, you know, interestingly, you... I like the smile. Interestingly, you know, I heard you once say about, you know, the difference between producing and executive producing, how, you know, producing, you're really in the mix a lot more on a day-to-day basis, and executive producing allows you to kind of be on the fringe to basically consult. And just to let everybody know, it was too many to remember offhand. I have the list of the features he's produced, and this is not all of the animation. Who Framed Roger Rabbit, Beauty and the Beast, nominated. You've been nominated for 18 Oscars?
Well, not me, but the movies, yeah.
That you produced?
Yeah.
Yeah. Beauty and the Beast, Lion King, Hunchback of Notre Dame, Emperor's New Groove, Atlantis, Nightmare Before Christmas, the 3D version in 2006, and Frankenweenie. In addition, you've produced, and this is just documentaries for Disney Nature, Earth, Waking Sleeping Beauty, we're going to talk about that briefly here, Oceans, Walt Disney's Christmas, Handheld, African Cats, Chimpanzee, High Ground, Tyrus, Richard M. Sherman, Songs of a Lifetime, and of course, The Gamble House, which we get to see. And of course, there's Maleficent and the new Lion King and the new Beauty and the Beast, in addition to a lot more. Tell us about your producing path a little bit.
Wow. I did not go to college and come out thinking that I wanted to be a producer. I didn't go to that many movies when I was a kid. I like movies, but I'm not a movie guy necessarily, which sounds odd. I was a music major in college and came out wanting to be a percussionist and play in orchestras. And I got a summer job at Disney, and it was total luck that I started there at the same time as Glenn and Tim Burton and Brad Bird and those guys. And also a lot of the Nine Old Men and people who came up with the idea of personality animation were still at the studio. So I would go deliver something, lunch or something to Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnston, and we'd talk about acting, or to Ken Anderson, you talk about art direction. So I was the luckiest guy on the planet. That was my university, in terms of what animation could do. And Eric Larson, who is one of my mentors, always said it'll flex any muscle you have, it'll test any curiosity you have about music or art or drawing or performance or acting, and it does. It does. So I fell in love more with animation than producing, and I wasn't going to be Glenn Keane. I wasn't going to be a terrific animator, and I loved the process, and I loved the people, and I still do. I mean, I genuinely do. I feel like it's so impossible to be an animator or a rigger or a whatever you do that those people need special care. I mean, not in a therapeutic sense, but in a sense of encouragement and team building, and knowing that it's okay to make mistakes, it's okay to fail, it's okay to be vulnerable. So a lot of what I do as a producer and what I believe in is creating a safe room for movies to happen. And that's, I also look at it as I'm a servant of the process, not the boss. Because bosses, I think, are boring in the end, because you have one person's point of view that you're trying to inflict. And if you're going to put one person's point of view on, it's much better that be the director or the storyteller. So in animation, the principal directors are the storytellers. So I try to support them. I can't keep my mouth shut, so I have a lot of creative input, but I see it really as a collaborative effort. And that's what I love about it. And the films that I've had that have been the most difficult or have been the most fun are always that way. They're always collaborative efforts where people feel free to make mistakes. I mean, Lion King, we've talked about this before. I couldn't get anybody to work on it. So I would say, it's this great story. It's kind of Joseph from the Bible meets Moses meets Hamlet in Africa with music by that great African composer, Elton John. And people would just say, well, good luck with that. And remember my sister just kind of hung up and just kind of thought like, what?
Yeah, and everyone wanted to work on Pocahontas. You guys might not know that, because Lion King became obviously kind of a big deal, but everyone, because, you know, we were saying, like, artistically, for an animator, Glenn was on it, Eric Goldberg was on it, Pomeroy, Mike Giammo was art directing, so everyone's like, Pocahontas, you know, and Jeffrey, it's gonna be like West Side Story, you know,
Yeah.
But then, you know, working on
It's West Side Story with American Indians.
Yeah, exactly.
He literally said it's West Side Story meets Dances with Wolves.
And it sold people.
Yeah, it's very clear.
Yeah.
And Lion King was like, well, it's an experiment. We don't quite know what we're doing, but you have to try new things. It was called King of the Jungle at the time. But what happened is we got some hungry people who never would have gotten a chance to lead a character or to step up and try whatever it was they were doing. And we got a really kind of hungry group of people that loved it, either loved, like Andreas Deja grew up on Jungle Book and loved Jungle Book, and he wanted to do quadrupeds. And other people wanted to get a chance to lead a character. So the group itself made that movie a reality out of their pure collective hunger to tell that story. And the story's an original story, but it's not. You know, it's kid gets framed by his uncle for murder, grows up in the wilderness, comes back unrecognized, and has to reclaim his kingdom. That's the whole story of Lion King. And that's a pretty common story in mythology, in the Bible, and that kind of thing. So it was really the interpretation of that made it interesting. But it goes back to, we kind of created that story and wrote that story in about 2 days in a room with the door closed with a lot of legal pads on the table. And the directors were in that room, and Brenda Chapman was in that room, and some really good story people, Chris Sanders. And we came out with a story because it was okay to say really stupid things. And I'm at the head of the class, you know, to be able to say, well, what if he has this like crazy baboon guy who carries a stick? Okay.
Just have James animate it. It'll be fine.
Well, in that case, it will be, yeah.
Yeah.
So I guess the way I love to approach producing is to be a servant of the process, and you can't do that all the time. Sometimes people need encouragement. Sometimes they need to be disciplined, for lack of a better word. But most of the time, people, I think, really respond to the idea that we're trying to do something together in a safe room. And that's a really exciting atmosphere to work in.
Yeah, that's what's interesting about Waking Sleeping Beauty, because you directed that. Was that your first that you directed?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, and that tugged on a lot of heartstrings for me, because just seeing that whole process makes me really think back a lot, you know, to that time. It was such a special time for animation and Disney in general, especially, you know, loving the history of it. And why was that more personal for you than a lot of the others? Well, I mean, they all are, but the one that's really close to your heart?
Well, it's Waking Sleeping Beauty, if you haven't seen it, it's a film about the animation renaissance in the 80s and 90s. And it's something I lived through, so that's probably why it's most personal. But also a story I wanted to tell, because it's a peek behind the curtain at a company that normally you don't get many peeks behind the curtain at. So Disney itself is very, it's a huge brand name, and it's very hard to say, well, this is really people, but it really is people. And we all experience that from time to time. You hide behind a brand name or a studio name or a film name, but you realize, no, we still come to work one day at a time, and it's a struggle, and we don't know what we're doing, and we're trying to get a good story out of whole cloth. We're trying to create interesting animation. And so the movie's about that. It's about the artistic struggle and about the kind of pantheon of characters, from executives and Roy Disney to artists and
To Frank Wells.
Frank Wells, yeah, who literally kind of lived and died through that period. Guys like Howard Ashman, who died in the AIDS crisis. And he did literally on his deathbed, was writing the songs for Beauty and the Beast. You know, and you think, wow, I have no idea, and God forbid any of us should ever have an idea of what that feels like, to be terminally sick, and at that time AIDS was a death sentence. And he got out of his head and got out of that by getting up enough courage and energy to write songs, you know, like Tale as Old as Time. I will never understand that as long as I live, but I'm fascinated by that, and that's a little bit of what that movie's about.
Yeah, if you haven't seen it, it's really quite something, because even though you might think that it's a different era than all of you are animating in now, if you're animators, you'll recognize all the same struggles, and you'll kind of go, oh, wasn't that different back then in a lot of ways too, especially here with the kind of atmosphere in Montreal with a lot of growing studios getting their start, and like everyone's just like figuring it out day to day, even on the best of days. It's really something to relate to.
Yeah, and you guys have a really interesting opportunity, because I think the growth and the chaos of a growing industry like in Montreal right now is where the great stuff happens. It happened at Disney in the 20s and 30s. It happened at Disney in the 80s and 90s. It happened at Pixar when everybody was 20 years old in the 90s, did their most incredible work. So when you're elderly like me, you don't necessarily have the same hunger and passion. You have the passion for sure, but life is looked at through a different lens. When an industry like this in Montreal particularly is growing and chaotic, and you're not sure what the future is, and there's a lot of product going on, there's an opportunity for greatness there that is so exactly alike what we went through in the 80s and 90s at Disney. When nobody would go see a Disney film, you were a fool to work in animation, because it was like, really? That's not going to last very long. Yeah. Disney tried to close down its animation division, and yet out of that, there were a bunch of really young and hungry people that came up in that process and said, no, we're going to show you there's something incredible to be done. And so I see an opportunity here, particularly for that kind of work to be done. You just have to believe it can be done.
That's it.
And you can't complain about budgets. We had $4 million to do the animation on Roger Rabbit. Beauty and the Beast cost $13 million. I mean, yes, it was in 1991, but still, it's like,
yeah,
that's not about the money. It's not about the money. It's about the creative choices and how you use that money and how you exercise your creative capital in certain areas of the movie. You know this.
Yeah, and obviously investing in people is like the best thing, because it's the people who make things.
Yeah, totally.
It's about the people. It's not. Anyway, I'm not going to get into my rant. Next category.
No, go ahead. Really.
No, because I think a lot of people are so focused on technology, and they're focused on, I mean, obviously you're there to produce a film and to get it done, and to get it done efficiently and be on time, and there's all the margins, but in the end, it's like your growth and you're gonna go. It's funny because a lot of people in Montreal will be going through a hard time. They're coming up, and their second show or third show, and it's like countless hours put in, and at times it's like it really stresses you out. But when it comes out and you look back, those times are so valuable, because so much of of who you see yourself and your self-esteem comes really hard earned. There's no easy ride to being great, No,
it's not easy ever. And if you've decided to live a creative life, welcome to the party. It's chaotic and difficult.
That's it.
And if that's not right for you, then you should be a gardener or something. But I feel like the creative life is a spectacular way to live, but it's full of a lot of struggle.
That's it. But you meet the greatest people, and
they become your family.
That's the thing. It's really like that. All right, next category.
I'm exhausted already. My brain kind of looks like a ham.
It's close to Thanksgiving.
It is. Oh.
So here's the thing.
This is a secret category.
So your education was as, you came up and you had a minor in art. We'll talk about another thing later. But, honestly, I never knew you're a painter. And online, on Facebook is the first time I was just astounded that these are iPad or iPhone paintings.
Well, I think we should all paint. It's just impossible and wonderful to be a painter. And I use my iPad only. I have an iPad Pro, and I use Procreate. I don't use a stylus. I just use my finger. And I just love it. And to me, filmmaking is like painting, and like everything I do in life is like painting. And I feel like it's such a wonderful thing to look at nature and try to understand what nature's doing. And
we know that very well here.
Yeah, I mean, it's partly because the best artists or best animators do that. The people I admire in the film business do that. And so I try to do that. I find it really therapeutic. What's amazing right now is a lot of my documentaries I shoot on Canon 5Ds, and the entry level to shooting a documentary and editing it is really low now. You can shoot an entire film. There was one at Sundance last year on your cell phone, and you could even cut it and score it on your cell phone if your fingers were small enough. There's a joke in there which I won't use. But the ability to enter that world and make a film, and in animation is the same way. You know, I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not saying the technology is easy, and I'm not trying to diminish at all the art of technology that goes into making those movies. But when you can make it transparent, I mean, that's the weird thing about animation or filmmaking. It's impossible and hard and grueling and chaotic, with the goal of getting rid of all that and suspending your disbelief long enough to get captured in this story about what it is to be human. So you all know how painful it is to be an artist or just do what you do during the day for a living. And yet in filmmaking, the goal is to make the audience forget that. To make the audience forget, when I see Roger Rabbit, it was impossible. And yet the audience shouldn't ever have to know that. Mm-hmm. So that's what I love about it.
Yeah.
I could go on.
Buzzer time.
Oh boy.
Oh boy. So, obviously you're on the board for Walt Disney Family Museum. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And why don't we start there? I mean, like D23, for me, I've never been able to make it up there, but could you tell us a bit about the 9 Old Men exhibit you're doing? That's super exciting to me. Yeah,
I'm curating a museum exhibition about the 9 Old Men, the animators that worked with Walt, and kind of, they weren't the inventors of character animation, but they were certainly the best known that Walt leaned on the most. So this would be like Frank Thomas, Mark Davis, Ward Kimball, those kinds of people. And it's a show that opens up at the Walt Disney Family Museum in the Presidio in San Francisco in May of this year. You must go out and see that place. First of all, even if you hate Walt Disney, it's inspiring about somebody who was persistent enough to find the money and the wherewithal to do whatever you wanted to do. And you learn that persistence is pretty much everything. You can do and you can accomplish anything, and not to sound corny, but you can really do almost anything if you're persistent enough about it. And so these 9 old men, as we call them, were his eyes and ears and hands in creating this, because he didn't draw and he didn't paint, and he was just a really interesting director. He was kind of a ham actor, and really interesting guy. So that show goes up in May, and what's been fun is, again, for selfish reasons, I've been able to go over to Ward Kimball's family's house and Frank Thomas's son Ted, and say, can I look through your garage and your boxes? And they're pulling out these paintings and artwork, and these guys, and they weren't the only people at the studio, but they were so prolific, and it wasn't about animating. Mark Davis animated Cruella de Vil and Maleficent, and when he was done with that, he drove down to Disneyland and he designed the Haunted Mansion and he designed Pirates of the Caribbean. And we went home at night, he got out a sketchbook and sketched, and we had vacation. He traveled to New Guinea in the 40s and 50s when it wasn't easy to travel to New Guinea, and collected native Pacific oceanic artwork.
And masks. Which lined the walls of his house. So and beautiful. He taught at Chouinard Art Institute. I mean, these guys had huge lives, and if I learned one thing from them and many people I ran into at Disney who I adore, it's that working in the film industry, or in animation in particular, is about having a big life. And whatever you're doing and wherever you are in your career, you're not traveling enough. You're not reading enough stuff. You're not going to enough conferences. And it's not about going to animation conferences even. It's about, these guys would take off and go, build locomotives in their backyard and travel to Europe and bring home boxes. And Walt went to Europe in 1935 and brought back 350 books in all these languages about fairy tales and art and architecture and that kind of thing. It's about photography, it's about drawing, it's about carrying a sketch pad wherever you go. So that idea of getting life experiences, how can you create the illusion of life unless you have a life? Yeah. So what I learned about these guys is just that. They had big lives. Wooly Reitherman, who I worked for, was a fighter pilot in the Second World War. He ran bombing missions in the Philippines. Wooly Reitherman. And he directed Jungle Book and 101 Dalmatians, all the movies that I looked at when I was a kid. So anyway, that's what I'm learning by doing these things. And it's,
So I still work. I'm an independent producer now, but I still do a lot of work for Disney. Just
almost more now for Disney.
Now a little bit more
away
almost.
from them, yeah.
Yeah. So here's the good and the bad of it. The good of it is it's a pretty cool company with a lot of good stuff going on. Full stop. It's great, and it's great to 20 years after a movie comes out to go make faces with Rafiki. So there's nothing bad about that. If there is another side to it, it's that you have to disassociate yourself with that and not be afraid to be your own artist. And that's really hard. It's hard for you. It's really hard for me to be able to say, yeah, I'm the Lion King guy or the Beauty and the Beast guy, along with many other people. You worked on Lion King. Then to just say, well, I'm also Don the painter. And for a long time, this is just talking about Don's weak spots. For a long time, I could go into a party, and if I got a little bored, I could just say, well, I produced Lion King, and people light up. And now I don't do that anymore. I go in and say, I'm a documentary filmmaker. And people still, they don't walk away, but they may want to, but you engage in more interesting conversations about things, and people have a point of view about that. So the Disney imprint and the Disney brand is terrific, but you can hide behind it. And I think that's the truth about our movies and all of you and what you do. It's easy to hide behind those things, and so important to live a big life that's your life completely, that you can own and say, well, yes, I'm proud to be associated with that company, and I am, and I still am, and lucky to be associated with them, but also want to be able to say, but I'm okay with saying I'm also a painter. I'm also really bad at picking up my socks around the house. I'm, here's the whole package of Don for good and for bad, and that's been a journey for me. It seems so worthwhile for some reason in terms of how you lead your life. I used to be really close to a guy named Joe Grant, and you remember Joe?
Story master, yeah.
Yeah, and Joe worked really closely with Walt Disney. Joe wrote Dumbo, and Joe's dog was named Lady, and he decided to write a story about Lady, and Walt said, well, you really should add this streetwise guy named Tramp, so he wrote Lady and the Tramp. He passed away when he was 95. He read the New Yorker cover to cover every day. He saw every movie on the weekends, and he was as frustrated as we all are. He was like, and the good and the bad of it is there's no retirement in the arts.
Right.
You don't just say, oh, I'm 65, I'm going to give up drawing and painting, and you don't do that, and you can't do that. If you've chosen the career properly, you can't stop.
Yeah.
And Joe used to say, and I always remember it, we were driving home from lunch one day, and he said, Don, it's an obsession. And he's right, it's an obsession. You do what you do. You direct movies because you can't not do it. And you all do the same thing. You're editing, or you're animating, or you're rigging, or lighting, or doing whatever you're doing because you can't not do it. And yes, you have aspirations, and yes, someday you'd like to write a book or direct or whatever, and you can and should do all those things, but it's an obsession.
Yeah.
And that was really inspiring because I could relate to that. I could relate to it just because that's what it feels like. It feels like you do what you're doing because you can't not do it. You work in the arts, you work in animation because there's really no other choice.
That's really it. That's really it. All right.
It's time again.
Yes, it's time. I think this is the last time.
Oh, yeah.
And so you are a music major. Your mom was a musician as well.
She was a musician. She was a keyboard, a pianist. So music was around the house all the time. And
how do you feel that's informed your artistic career?
Oh, it was just kind of a language that I always grew up with. The best thing for me is I've had a vocabulary to deal with musicians, and I've made a lot of musicals. So it was not intimidating because I could have a conversation with a composer or whatever about it. Not in a technical way, not in a, I would never go to Hans Zimmer and say, hey, could you go up a half step here at the bridge? It's like...
What are you talking about?
Yeah.
It's perfect.
So it wasn't ever that.
Yeah.
But you can have a kind of vocabulary to be able to talk about things, to talk about tone. And what's really interesting when you talk to somebody like Hans or Sting or Elton John or anybody, Tim Rice, Howard Ashman, Alan Menken, you know what they talk about? They talk about story. They don't talk about music or keys or instruments or if this is going to be a banjo or whatever. They talk about story. And what's the character thinking? How am I feeling? How am I trying to evoke that with my music? And I found that really the common language of what we do. So you can, so being a musician was and is great. I don't get a chance to play that much anymore, but it gave me at least some confidence to have those conversations and to learn that the shared commonality between all of us as filmmakers is that common desire to tell our stories.
Yeah, that's it.
No matter what you do.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of artists that I know that are musicians on the side. I think there's something that's very correlated, because I think in essence, if you were to really break down animating in any way, whether it's oil on glass or stop motion or 2D or CG or whatever, Flash, it's oddly very mathematical underneath everything, but it comes out as an artistic endeavor, much as music is purely mathematical. And yet, it's really, the human voice, I think, is the ultimate instrument. But, the fact that music and, for us in animation, especially for me drawing, is all about evoking emotions and kind of finding your own way.
When we were doing Lion King, it was funny. One day Hans said he wanted to use kind of the most primal instruments known to man, and he said, the first music instruments is you hit things and you yell. And I thought, oh, that's really funny, but he wasn't joking at all. It's drums and hitting things, and it's these primal cries. So if you listen to the Lion King soundtrack, it's it's all that, and shouting and these cries in the wilderness and drums.
Yeah.
And that's pretty cool. That's really old. That's 30,000 years old.
Yeah.
And it hits you somewhere inside that you don't even know you have. And I love that kind of approach to storytelling.
Yeah, especially going back again to Lion King, not to keep talking about that, but I think for Hans Zimmer, he invested himself on a deeper level on that one, because it's so, just the choir alone that he uses so much of, and his orchestration, if you think of even something gentle like The Land, if you think of that track, or To Die For, you put them on now and instantly your body reacts to it, and it's, I think it's such a nice tie between music and animation. One helps the other so incredibly much.
Well, it's so universal because at least at Disney, all the movies are dubbed. So we did Lion King in 33 languages or something.
Right.
So the music is the common denominator in the track that kind of keeps the story moving forward. The same is true for Alan Menken. His background is Broadway, and when he was working with, whether it's Tim Rice or Howard Ashman, that's all about putting the plot in the songs themselves, which is the conversation we had earlier about your movie, which we have to talk about more, is the songs, when done properly, and it's really hard to do in movies, but when done properly, you put the plot twists and the most important emotional turning points of your characters in the songs. Well, that takes a huge leap of faith. You go, what do you mean put them in the songs? I want that character to play it out on the screen and have an emotional moment. But if you're going to make a musical, you have to just buy into it and say, no, when Ariel wants to get rid of her voice and sprout legs so she can go on land and fall in love with Eric, it's done in a song, with Ursula's song, or Kiss the Girl in that movie, or
Mulan Leaving.
It's done in the context of the lyrics in the song. Yeah. So that takes a leap of faith, but that's what musicals are in terms of putting those important plot turning points right in those songs so that they have a meaning. Otherwise, why have them? You don't need them.
That's it.
Thank God we've exhausted every topic.
I think that's every category.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing. And that's obviously, for anyone who's just looking at that, it's every category could be a 2 to 3 hour discussion with Don.
So it's important not to say, oh wow, what a great guy, he does everything, because I don't. I try to do everything. But
you can't beatbox.
Well, that's not true. No. You spoiled my next number. It's a life of struggle and a life that we all aspire to lead, which is a life of expression. Walt Stanchfield, who you knew, always said, impression without expression equals depression. So we're impressed with so many images and so much news and just stuff that comes into our head every day, that we need to find those ways to get that out of our head and express ourselves. And that's going to be in our day job, that's going to be in our books, that's going to be in our reading, that's going to be in our travel, that's going to be in our living a bigger life than we are now. And that's going to help us have more balance to our lives. So that's what I try to do and fail often, but that's the kind of life I get excited about.
Yeah, and I think it's just a nice look for everyone to, I mean, I think that's the thing people think will go away, the struggle. But you know, if you don't struggle, it means you're not searching for something. And I think the search is a thing that fascinates me like all the time.
There's a great Andy Warhol quote, if I can remember it. It's, your job isn't to worry about what people say about your work or what critics say about your work. Your job is to make art. And when people look at it and have something to say, your job then is to make more art. And then when critics say, gee, I like it or I don't like it, that's not your job. Your job is then to make more art. So that's what we do. We express ourselves, we make the art. Yes, we try to please people, but we're trying to get it out of our system and show people what it's like to be you, what it's like to be me, what it's like to live in this world, which is chaotic and complicated, but that's what we do for a living.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.